Good morning and welcome to our guests who have joined us for our virtual 3 and 30 this morning, and welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Peter Schertz, Jack and Marianne Frable Curator of Ancient Art. And the talk today, or the title, is New Rotations in the Ancient Art Galleries. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, thanks a lot. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us in this, our Zoom 3 and 30. So I'm going to talk about 3 recent changes to the ancient art galleries. There have been a number of them, including, in Egypt, which I won't talk to you about, but we have animal mummies on view now. And the first change is to talk about these little fellows. They are from Loristan, that's a province in modern Iran. And they're about 3,000 years old, plus minus 3,900, 3,700, 2,700 years old. And that's the early Iron Age. The peoples who produced these were nomads, so we don't know a lot about them, but we have many objects from their cultures, including these, which are pendants. We know they're pendants because of the little hooks here and because of their size, so you can put a cord through them and hang them. And they're mountain goats. And we were given them about 10, 11 years ago. And I loved them when I saw them because I love goats, and wasn't quite sure what to do with them because we don't really do a lot with what's called the ancient Near East or Western Asia. But I knew we would be able to use them. And then finally, through discussions with colleagues about a really interesting and controversial term or period of Greek art called the Orientalizing Period, and I'll explain that in a moment, I realized these goats help explain an early phase of historic Greek art from about 700 BCE to 600 BCE, when a style of art develops called the wild goat style. We have a lovely example of it in this oinochoe, or wine pitcher, and you can see the goats on it. And you can see why I wanted to put the goats in dialogue with the vase. They are similar. And it's to make a really important point, especially in the 21st century, especially in the second decade of the 21st century. As some of you may know, there's been a rise of white nationalism. And part of that renewed movement of white nationalism has been to try to configure Greece and Rome as sort of pure European cultures. And Greece and Rome, like any other culture, were deeply connected to the other cultures around them and would not have developed the way they developed without being influenced from those cultures. And of course, the influence goes back and forth because, as I like to point out to people, referencing a famous poem by John Donne, he wrote, "No man is an island." Also, no culture is an island. Every culture interacts with other cultures and, again, mutual influences. And with these goats, even though the Greeks aren't in direct contact with Loristan, they are with Anatolia. And Anatolian goats look pretty similar to the goats on the vase and reasonably similar to the Loristan goats. So it allows me to talk about early Greeks and their neighbors in the gallery. And here's that term I was using, the Orientalizing Period. It's a very odd term these days because it comes from the same Latin root as Orientalism, a very different phenomenon. But it's the term that allows you to find out, if you Google it, if you look it up in books, how heavily non-Greek civilizations influenced the Greeks. And it comes from the Latin root oriens, which means to the east, with reference to the location of Greece and later of Rome. Again, it's a difficult term these days because of Orientalism, a very different phenomenon that involves frequently disparaging Western European and Anglo looks at Eastern civilizations, but it has the same root, but again, totally different connotations. And I needed to talk about that, the influence of other cultures on Greece. And because I see my role as a curator to inspire people to learn more, I had to give them a word that you can look up, Orientalizing. The second alteration to the gallery involves a recent purchase from 2020. It's an Etruscan Gold Reef. Those of you who are familiar with our gallery might recall that we have two Hellenistic Greek gold reefs. This is an Etruscan example. The Etruscans are a civilization in central Italy. They arise about 2,800 years ago. They have an enormous influence, especially on the early history of Rome. Periodically, Etruscan kings ruled over Rome. Even when the monarchy is abolished in Rome, Etruscan culture continues to influence the Romans. But eventually the Romans supplant them in central Italy, and actually the Romans supplant practically everybody in the Mediterranean world eventually. Again, it's a beautiful wreath. For a long time, I've wanted to bring in an example of Etruscan gold work into our collection because the Etruscans were famous for their gold work. And this, all by itself, can convey the importance of gold work in Etruria. But it will also, it's such a spectacular example, we can get additional examples that don't have to be quite as imposing. Now, I'd like to talk about the ends of these, because there's a repoussé design that's hard to see in the gallery, but you can see on this image of it. And it seems to be a scene of healing with an elderly man. We know he's elderly because he's shown as being bald with long hair and a beard, being healed by a winged figure. We don't know exactly what the scene is, but we think it's probably the healing of Philoctetes. You can see somewhere along here a quiver, and Philoctetes is a Greek hero who sails off to Troy with the other Greeks to attack the city and bring back Helen. He is the owner of the famous bow of Heracles, but he does something, and in different versions of the myth, he does different things that brings down the wrath of the gods upon him. And a snake bites his foot or his heel, and the wound will not heal. And that makes him impure in the eyes of the Greeks. So in order to avoid being harmed by the gods further, they abandon him on an island and they go off to fight Troy, or to fight the Trojans, until there's a prophecy that says you will not take the city of Troy until you get the bow of Heracles back. So in many versions, it's Odysseus who goes off to get the bow. And in some versions, he heals Philoctetes and brings him back to fight at Troy. Now, this is a Greek story, but it's very possible the Etruscans adopted the myth to their own cultural needs and conventions. And in Greek versions of the healing of Philoctetes, he's always shown standing upright, so vertically, not on the ground as he appears here. So my suspicion is that it's very possible that whoever made this design was familiar with this vase, which was found in the city of Volchi. It's one of the most famous surviving Greek Attic, meaning made in Athens, vases from the ancient world. And it's Achilles, the great Greek hero, binding up the wounded arm of Patroclus. Again, they're both on the ground, just as they are here. So I have a feeling that it's an example of the Etruscans knowing a Greek myth, Philoctetes, knowing Greek art, and when they were figuring out how do we show a healing scene, whoever made this design said, oh yeah, you show a healing scene with two people on the ground. Can't prove it, but it's interesting that they're both from Volchi, because that's where most of these gold crowns come from. And I wanted to take advantage of doing this on Zoom to show you what the case looked like before and after the addition of that crown, of that wreath. And I think it's a lovely case, our Etruscan display. But it really brightens up with a bit of bling. And that's what the crown does. That's a better lit picture, I know, put aside the quality of my abilities as a photographer, which are not strong, but the wreath really pops out in the display and draws attention to the whole display. And that's, to my mind, that's a really successful acquisition for the museum. It's something that we needed, gold Etruscan work. And it holds a case. It can hold its own in the case. Doesn't disappear. Now, the last object I'll talk about and how we've displayed it is this Tyrrhenian amphora. It's a neck amphora, meaning it has a very pronounced neck. An amphora is just a storage jar, typically for wine, but also for other materials. And Tyrrhenian comes from the Greek word for the Etruscans. Some of you maybe have heard of the Tyrrhenian Sea off the west coast of central Italy. That's also same Tyrrhenians, same Greek-inspired name. And there are many fascinating things about this vase, not least of which is the erotic scene on top. But also, this is a type of vase. About 265 examples are known. Almost all of them have been found in Etruria. Some people used to think possibly the Etruscans painted them, but the clay is not Etruscan, it's an Attic clay. So we know they were produced in Athens. And it raises fascinating questions about the connection between the Etruscan buyers, the merchants who were taking things from Athens to Etruria, and the producers, the potters and painters in Etruria, that so many of these end up in Etruria. When you compare it with, and skip ahead, to other vases produced in Athens in roughly the same period, these two panel paintings, this is looks much older. It's in an older style, closer to Corinthian art than what the Athenians were doing. Did the Etruscans have conservative tastes in art? Maybe. Did the merchants who provided objects for the Etruscans think the Etruscans had conservative tastes in art? Maybe. Did Greek vase painters just say, oh, the Etruscans bought this old-fashioned stuff 20 years ago, we're going to still keep making it for them? And we don't know. Again, many things we don't know about antiquity, but we do get to speculate, and it's kind of fun to speculate. This is what the Tyrrhenian vase looks like in the gallery display. It's a redone presentation of the symposium. We have a number of loans in the case, the horsehead amphora, an eye cup, and VMFA owns one eye cup, but it has a really important image in the center. On the other side, in the interior of the cup, called a tondo. This is a tondo. So we show the tondo, but we can't show the eyes. You can show one side or the other. So it's great that we can now show an eye cup, and you can see the eyes in the picture up here and down here. A smaller cup with comas, dancer figures on it, and the return to display after many years of being on loan to different exhibitions of our ram's head rhyton. And that's the new vase in it.
All right, thank you, Peter. I think that was perfect. A question for you, Peter. Are the Iranian and the Etruscan cultures at the same time, or can you outline a timeline?
That's a fascinating question. They are, from our perspective. The pendants, the bronze pendants, again, because there's so few physical remains and so little is known about the Loristan cultures, or probably cultures in the plural, nomadic groups that have many things shared in common, but we don't know if they thought of themselves as a group. They're from about 900 to, dependence, or 900 to 700 BCE, more or less. The Etruscans grow out of an earlier Italic civilization called the Villanovans, and they emerge as a recognizable, distinct culture, and it's a shift, not a replacement, around 800 BCE in central Italy. And they dominate in central Italy until the rise of the power of Rome. They are still active and recognizable around 300 BCE, but by the 2nd century, they're more or less disappeared as an independent culture. The Emperor Claudius reputedly made a dictionary of the Etruscan language, which has been lost. We do have inscriptions, some of which we can read, most of which we can't. So they are kind of roughly at the same time, but very different cultures. So the people of Lauriston are nomadic. They wander around. They're pastoralists. The Etruscans are settled. Again, we just don't know a lot about the peoples of Lauriston as nomads.
Can you explain the story that is happening in the horse fighting scene on the Black Amphora?
Okay. Well, I know I've said repeatedly, we don't know. And this is, yet another example of things that we have these objects from thousands of years ago. And, people didn't write down on the bottoms of the vase, this is why I painted this scene and this is what it means. We don't have artist statements, for instance. It's a wonderful vase. It's caused a tremendous amount of speculation amongst vase specialists about what's going on in the scene. If I can share my screen, I'll go back to the image again, just so people can see it. Okay, so it's this vase here that she's asking about. And it shows a mare and a stallion fighting over a foal, who seems to be a female foal. And this is how horses play. It may just be a playful daily life kind of scene, but art historians love to interpret and sometimes over-interpret, or just speculate. Never mind interpretation. We look for meaning. What could this mean? We have scenes on Greek art of warriors fighting over a fallen warrior. And you think of the battles that you read about in the Iliad over the fallen body of Achilles, of Patroclus, for instance. So that's a genre, that's a type of scene that we know exists in Greek art. And maybe this vase painter, who's called the swing painter, who often creates playful imagery, maybe he's parodying that image. Maybe he's taking the motif of Greeks fighting Amazons, another common motif in Greek art, and again, playing with it and making a male and female horse fighting instead of a male and female warrior fighting. Another speculative interpretation is that it's a metaphor, and it's a metaphor of the Greeks and the Persians, so the masculine Greek males versus effeminate Persians to the Greek mind, fighting over Ionia, the western coast of modern Turkey, where there were many powerful Greek cities, sometimes were incorporated into the Persian Empire, sometimes they were independent. And the Greeks, especially the mainland Greeks, this is what you read about in Herodotus. They fought to preserve the independence of those Greek city-states. So it might be a metaphor. But we don't know. And again, the wonderful thing is that we don't know, and we get to speculate and we get to search for what is the meaning of this silent object.
And we have a question asks if there are any differences between the healing images on the end pieces of the reef.
No. One of the images, we have photographed both of them. One is harder to read than the other. But, to do that kind of reprise, you make the design into a hard substance, even just clay, and you hammer the gold on top of it. And gold leaf is really thin and delicate. That's why we can cover the domes of Capitol buildings with gold, because it doesn't take a lot of gold to cover a Capitol building, believe it or not. But it looks impressive when you do it. But you hammer it in, you basically, press it down with a hammer or other material to create those reprises. So it's a mold-made thing, which means you can endlessly repeat it till the mold gives out.
Thank you, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Okay. Thanks, Lulan, and thanks all for coming.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.